They found Rachel Norden's body on November 14th, in the exact warehouse bay where two separate search teams had spent a combined 11 hours looking 3 weeks earlier. So either both teams missed a corpse lying in plain sight, or she wasn't there when they searched. And if she wasn't there then, someone put her there after, which means someone watched the searches, waited for them to finish, and moved her into a space investigators had already cleared. The call came from a maintenance contractor doing asbestos assessment. He'd been alone in the building for 40 minutes before he radioed it in, voice shaking so hard dispatch had to ask him to repeat the location twice. By the time I arrived, the scene was already compromised. Footprints everywhere, disturbed dust patterns. The contractor sitting in his truck with the door open, still holding his radio. The warehouse district had been dead for 30 years. 5 buildings, all connected by loading tunnels and shared basements, spread across 4 acres of cracked asphalt and chain link fence. When Rachel disappeared on October 19th, this complex was the obvious place to search. She'd been jogging the waterfront path that runs right past the property. Her phone last pinged a tower half a mile south at 6:42 a.m. She never made it home. The initial search happened fast. Dogs, grid teams, thermal imaging. They hit all 5 buildings over 2 days, October 21st and 22nd. Building 3, where the body turned up, got searched twice because the dogs kept circling back to it. Both times they found nothing but rat nests and ancient shipping manifests. I pulled the search logs that afternoon. Team Alpha, October 21st, 10:15 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. They documented every room, every corner. Bay 7, where Rachel was found, was listed as clear. Photographs showed empty space, scattered debris, intact dust on the floor. Team Bravo returned October 22nd for a secondary pass. Bay 7. Clear again. More photographs. Same empty floor. But on November 14th, Rachel Norden was lying on that same floor, face up, fully clothed, no visible trauma. The contractor had walked within 6 feet of her before his flashlight caught her hand. I need you to understand what this means. A body doesn't appear. Bodies decompose, they settle, they leave traces. If she'd been there during the searches, the dogs would have hit on decomposition scent. If she'd been dead elsewhere and moved later, there would be transfer evidence, fibers, soil, fluids. If she'd been alive somewhere else and died recently, the decomposition timeline wouldn't match the 3-week gap. The medical examiner gave me preliminary findings by 6 p.m. Time of death, approximately 3 weeks prior, give or take 72 hours. Cause of death, undetermined, pending toxicology. No defensive wounds, no ligature marks, no sexual assault. No obvious trauma beyond some bruising on her upper arms consistent with restraint. Someone holding her, not striking her. 3 weeks prior meant she died right around the time she disappeared, which meant she'd been dead the entire time we were searching, which meant she was somewhere else when we searched this building, and someone moved her here afterward. I stood in Bay 7 at sunset, watching the forensic team work. The dust patterns were wrong. You spend enough time at crime scenes, you learn to read disturbance. The floor around her body showed scuff marks, drag patterns. But they were recent. Days, not weeks. And here's the detail that made my hands cold. The dust under her body was intact. Intact dust means she was placed, not dragged. Placed carefully, deliberately, in a position that mimicked how someone might fall naturally. Her arms were at her sides. Her head was straight. Her shoes were still tied. The only disruption in the surrounding dust came from the contractor's approach and the responding officers. But between her body and the nearest wall, 8 feet of undisturbed surface. Between her and the loading dock door, 12 feet of undisturbed surface. If someone carried her in, they'd walked a path that left no marks. I requested the search team photographs be enhanced and compared frame by frame. By 8 p.m., the lab sent results. In the October 21st photos, you could see a pattern in the dust accumulation. Streaks near the west wall, consistent with ventilation currents from the broken windows. In the November 14th scene photos, those same streaks were gone. The dust had been disturbed and resettled, meaning someone had been in that bay between the searches and the discovery, doing something that kicked up enough dust to erase the old patterns. That night I drove the perimeter of the complex, counting sightlines. 7 locations where someone could watch the property without being seen from the road. 3 with direct view into Building 3's loading area. If you parked on the access road behind the grain elevator, you could see anyone entering or leaving through Bay 7's dock door, but no one driving past on the main waterfront road would see you. Rachel's family lived 6 miles east. I'd interviewed them twice in October. Standard missing person protocol. Parents, 2 siblings, boyfriend of 3 years. Everyone cooperative. Everyone with alibis for the morning she disappeared. Her mother had kept her room exactly as it was. Her father had organized search volunteers. Her boyfriend had posted flyers across 4 counties. On November 15th, I went back. This time I wasn't asking about the disappearance. I was asking about the days after the initial searches ended. Rachel's mother, Carol, sat across from me with her hands folded. I asked who'd known about the search results. Who'd known Building 3 had been cleared. She said everyone. It had been in the local news, posted on the volunteer coordination page, discussed in the family group text. The search teams had been thanked publicly. Building 3, along with the other 4, had been marked as eliminated from the search grid. I asked if anyone had gone back to the buildings after the official search ended. Carol's expression changed. She said Rachel's boyfriend, Derek, had. Multiple times. He told the family he couldn't accept that she wasn't there, that he felt like the searchers had missed something. He'd gone alone, using bolt cutters on the chain link fence, searching through the night when he couldn't sleep. When I asked how many times, Carol said she didn't know. At least 4 or 5 that he'd mentioned. Maybe more he hadn't talked about. The family had worried about him, about his mental state, but they'd understood the need to do something. I called Derek at 9:30 p.m. He agreed to meet me immediately. No lawyer, no hesitation. That should have reassured me. It didn't. We met at a diner, on Route 7, halfway between the warehouse and his apartment. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks, hollowed out, shadows under his eyes, hands that couldn't stay still. He ordered coffee he didn't drink. I asked him about the warehouse visits. He confirmed everything his mother-in-law had said, then offered more. He'd been there 6 times total. First time on October 24th, 2 days after the official search ended. He'd gone through Building 3 systematically, every bay, every room, convinced the teams had missed something. He'd found nothing, but he'd kept going back. October 27th, November 1st, November 4th, November 8th, November 12th, 2 days before the body was found. I asked why he'd gone on November 12th specifically. He said he'd been thinking about the search photographs, about the way the dogs had circled Building 3. He'd wanted to check Bay 7 one more time. He'd spent an hour there, moving debris, checking behind the old machinery, looking for any space where someone could be hidden. I asked what he'd found. He said nothing. Bay 7 had been completely empty, same as the search teams had documented. I asked if he'd disturbed the dust. He said probably, walking around. I asked if he'd noticed anything different about the floor. He said no, just old concrete and debris. Then I asked the question that had been building since the medical examiner's call. Did he go back after November 12th? Did he return to Building 3 before the contractor found the body? Derek went silent. His hands stopped moving. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, confusion maybe, or realization that the questions had shifted. He said no. November 12th was his last visit. He'd finally accepted that she wasn't there, that continuing to search was just hurting him more. I asked what time he'd left the warehouse on the 12th. He said around 11 p.m. I asked if anyone had seen him there. He said no, he'd been alone. I asked if he'd seen anyone else. He said the place was always deserted. But here's what made me drive back to the warehouse at midnight, standing in Bay 7 with a flashlight. Derek had been there 48 hours before the body was discovered. If the body had been there on the 12th, he would have seen it. If the body wasn't there on the 12th, someone put it there between his visit and the contractor's discovery on the 14th. A 48-hour window. And Derek had no alibi for either night. He lived alone. He worked from home. He could have been anywhere. I spent the rest of that night reviewing everything we had. Rachel's phone records, her bank statements, her social media. Her last text had been to Derek at 6:38 a.m. on October 19th. Early start, should be home by 8. Her phone went dark 4 minutes later. Derek's phone showed him at home that morning. His location data didn't move until 8:45 a.m. when he drove to Rachel's parents' house to ask if she'd arrived there. His first call to police came at 9:12 a.m. Everything about his timeline suggested a worried boyfriend doing exactly what you'd expect. But now I was looking at it differently. If Derek had gone to the warehouse on October 19th, before calling anyone, he'd have known to leave his phone at home. The waterfront path Rachel jogged was a 20-minute drive from his apartment. Less if you pushed the speed limit. He could have left at 6:30, intercepted her, brought her somewhere, returned home by 8 to establish his alibi, then started the worried boyfriend routine. Except that didn't explain where he'd kept her for 3 weeks, or why he'd repeatedly returned to the warehouse if he'd hidden her somewhere else, or how he'd moved her body without leaving any trace evidence. I needed to find the primary scene, where she'd actually died, where she'd been kept before being moved to the warehouse, because that's where the evidence would be. The real evidence, not this staged discovery site. On November 16th, I brought in cadaver dogs to sweep Derek's apartment, his parents' property, and his workplace storage unit. All came back negative. No scent, no traces, no disturbance that couldn't be explained by normal use. I seized his vehicle, a 2008 Subaru Outback. Forensics found Rachel's DNA, but that was expected. She'd been in his car hundreds of times. What they didn't find was any indication of a body being transported. No decomposition markers, no cleaning agent residue suggesting a scrub down, no trunk liner replacement. I brought Derek in for a formal interview on the 17th. This time with his lawyer present, everything recorded, all protocols followed. I asked about Rachel's last morning. He described their routine. They didn't live together, but spent most nights at his place. She'd left at 6:30 to get in her run before work. He'd kissed her goodbye, gone back to bed, woken at 7:45. When she hadn't returned by 8:30, he'd started worrying. By 9, he was calling her phone. By 9:15, he was driving her route looking for her. His lawyer interjected frequently, reminding Derek he didn't have to answer, watching me for any procedural slip. But Derek kept talking, kept explaining, kept insisting he'd done everything right. He'd coordinated volunteer searches, he'd posted rewards, he'd taken time off work to look for her himself. I asked about the warehouse visits again. Why Building 3 specifically? Derek said because the dogs had reacted there, because it was close to where her phone last pinged, because he couldn't accept that the searches had been thorough enough. Then I asked the question that had been eating at me for 2 days. If he'd searched Bay 7 on November 12th and found it empty, why hadn't he searched it again on the 13th? Why wait until the contractor found her on the 14th? Derek stared at me. His lawyer started to object, but Derek spoke first. He said he'd told me already. November 12th was his last visit. He'd stopped searching after that. He'd given up. I asked why. What specifically made him stop after 6 visits? After months of obsessive searching? What changed on November 12th that made him walk away? Derek's hands started shaking. He said he'd realized he was making it worse. That his family was worried about him. That continuing to tear himself apart wasn't bringing Rachel back. His therapist had told him he needed to start accepting reality. His lawyer ended the interview there. But I'd seen Derek's face when I asked about the 13th. For just a second, something had flickered across his expression. Not confusion, not grief, something else. Something that looked like calculation. I went back to the timeline. October 19th, Rachel disappears. October 21st and 22nd, official searches find nothing. October 24th through November 12th, Derek makes 6 visits to the warehouse. November 14th, body discovered. If the body had been moved between the 12th and 14th, I needed to know who had access to Building 3 during that window. The property owner was a holding company in Delaware that hadn't responded to calls. The chain-link fence around the complex had been cut in multiple places, Derek's doing according to him, though he couldn't say which cuts were his. The loading dock doors were all unsecured or broken. Anyone could have entered. But not just anyone knew that Bay 7 had been searched and cleared. That information had been on the volunteer coordination page, yes, but who actually read those updates? I pulled the access logs from the website. 247 unique visitors in October, dropping to 31 in November. I cross-referenced the November visitors with known associates of Rachel and Derek. Derek had access to the page 18 times in November. His last login was November 13th at 2:43 a.m. I called him at 6 a.m. on the 18th. No lawyer this time, just me and my phone and a direct question. Why were you on the volunteer coordination page at 2:43 in the morning on November 13th? Derek said he checked it every day, that he couldn't sleep, that he'd been obsessively monitoring for any updates. I asked what he was looking for. He said anything. Any new lead, any sign someone had information. But the page hadn't been updated since November 7th. There'd been nothing new to see. So why log in at 2:43 a.m. unless he was checking something specific? Unless he was verifying that Bay 7 was still listed as cleared. Derek hung up. His lawyer called me 30 minutes later and said all future communication would go through him. That was fine. I didn't need Derek to talk anymore. I needed evidence. I got the warrant for Derek's computer and phone records on November 19th. The digital forensics team found his search history. On November 12th, after his warehouse visit, he'd searched, how long does it take for a body to decompose? Can cadaver dogs detect old remains? Do police research cleared areas? And statute of limitations missing person? On November 13th, the day between his last visit and the body's discovery, he'd searched anonymous tip line. How to report finding something without identifying yourself. And can police trace payphone calls? But he hadn't called any tip line. He hadn't reported anything. The contractor had found Rachel. Unless Derek had known the contractor was scheduled to be there. Unless he'd timed the placement for exactly when someone would discover it. I pulled the building inspection records. The asbestos assessment had been scheduled for November 14th at 9 a.m. The appointment had been posted on the property management company's public calendar 3 weeks earlier. Anyone could have seen it. On November 20th, I drove to the grain elevator access road behind the warehouse complex. The position I'd identified as the best surveillance point. I parked and watched Building 3's loading area for 6 hours. At 3 p.m., a car pulled onto the access road and stopped 200 yards behind me. Dark sedan, driver alone. It sat there for 40 minutes, engine running, before leaving. I ran the plate. The car was registered to Derek's father. That night, I called Derek's father, Martin. He confirmed he'd been at the warehouse, said he'd been visiting the site where his future daughter-in-law had been found, trying to understand. I asked if he'd been there before. He said yes, several times since the discovery. I asked if he'd been there before the discovery. He went quiet. Then he said he'd gone once in early November to see where Derek kept searching, to understand why his son was torturing himself. He'd watched Derek go through Building 3 on November 8th, seen him moving debris, checking corners, refusing to give up. Martin said it had broken his heart, watching his son fall apart. I asked if he'd gone back after November 8th. Martin said no. I asked if Derek knew his father had followed him. Martin said no, he'd stayed hidden, hadn't wanted to embarrass his son by revealing he'd been worried enough to track him. But if Martin had watched Derek search on November 8th, he'd have seen the same thing Derek had. Bay 7 was empty, and if Martin knew the official searches had cleared the building, if he'd seen his son's obsessive checking, if he'd watched his son spiral deeper into grief and desperation, would that have given him ideas? I pulled Martin's phone records. On November 13th at 7:20 p.m., he'd received a call from Derek that lasted 4 minutes. On November 13th at 11:35 p.m., Martin's phone pinged a tower half a mile from the warehouse complex. At 1:15 a.m. on November 14th, his phone pinged the same tower again, heading away from the area. I brought Martin in on November 21st. His lawyer, same firm as Derek's, arrived within minutes. Martin said nothing. His lawyer said nothing. I showed them the phone records, the tower pings, the timeline that put him at the warehouse complex hours before the contractor's discovery. Martin's lawyer said his client had been driving around that night, unable to sleep, grieving the loss of someone he'd considered family. The warehouse was on a route he'd driven dozens of times. The tower pings proved nothing. I asked about the November 13th phone call with Derek. Martin said his son had called to talk, that Derek had been having a hard night. I asked what they'd discussed. Martin said grief, memories, the unfairness of Rachel being gone. I asked if they'd discussed the warehouse. Martin said no. But Derek's phone records told a different story. During that 4-minute call, Derek had accessed the property management company's calendar. He'd looked at the asbestos assessment appointment scheduled for the following morning. And immediately after hanging up with his father, he'd searched how to make an anonymous tip look real. I needed the primary scene, the place where Rachel had actually been kept for 3 weeks, because that would have transfer evidence that couldn't be cleaned away, her DNA, her possessions, signs of captivity. Without it, I had suspicious behavior and convenient timing, but no proof of murder. On November 22nd, I re-interviewed Rachel's family, this time asking different questions. Not about Rachel's habits or the morning she disappeared, but about Derek and Martin, about their relationship, about where Martin lived, where he worked, what properties he had access to. Rachel's mother said Martin had always been kind to them, supportive, almost as devastated by Rachel's death as Derek. He'd helped coordinate searches, donated money for the reward fund, attended vigils. He'd been a presence throughout everything. I asked about Martin's properties. Carol said he owned his house in town and a hunting cabin about 40 miles north, near the state forest. The cabin had been in his family for generations. Derek used to go there with him sometimes before Rachel's disappearance. She didn't think Derek had been back since. I got the warrant for Martin's cabin on November 23rd. The forensic team hit it on the 24th, Thanksgiving morning. I met them there at dawn. The cabin was isolated, set back from a dirt road, surrounded by pine forest. Single-story, wood construction, probably built in the 60s. The windows were intact, but dirty. The door was locked, with a new deadbolt hardware store receipt in Martin's car dated October 20th, the day after Rachel disappeared. Inside, the main room looked normal. Furniture dusty but arranged. Kitchen functional but unused recently. Bedroom untouched. But in the basement, accessible through a door off the kitchen, we found it. The basement was finished. Drywall, concrete floor, single window well with bars installed recently. In the corner, a camping cot with clean sheets. Next to it, a chemical toilet, a case of water bottles, and a bag of non-perishable food. On the floor near the cot, zip tie fragments. On the wall, scratches in the drywall at hand height. Thin lines, fingernail width, clustered in two groups. Rachel's DNA was everywhere. Hair on the cot, skin cells on the zip ties, fingerprints on the water bottles. The forensic team said the scene was consistent with someone being held there, confined but alive, for an extended period. The scratches on the wall were measured and documented. 2 clusters, each containing multiple parallel lines. The spacing matched finger width. The depth suggested repeated scratching over time, not frantic clawing. Someone keeping count. Someone marking days. The first cluster had 22 scratches. The second had 3. 22 days from October 19th, when Rachel disappeared, brought us to November 9th. 3 more days brought us to November 12th. The day Derek made his final warehouse visit. The day he'd claimed he'd given up searching. I arrested Martin on November 25th. His lawyer argued the cabin evidence didn't prove his client had held Rachel there, that Derek had access to the property, that the timeline we were suggesting was speculation, that the cell tower records put Martin's phone near the cabin on October 20th, 23rd, 27th, 31st, November 4th, 8th, and 11th. Each visit consistent with someone checking on a captive. Derek's phone had pinged towers near the cabin only once, on November 12th, after his warehouse visit. He'd been there for approximately 2 hours, from 11:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. on the 13th. I arrested Derek on November 26th. He still said nothing. His lawyer still said nothing. But the forensic evidence was building. In Martin's car, luminol revealed blood traces in the trunk, microscopic but present. DNA testing matched Rachel. In Derek's car, Fiber analysis found threads from the basement carpet caught in his tire treads, consistent with him driving there on November 12th. The theory assembled itself through evidence. Martin had taken Rachel on October 19th, intercepted her during her run somehow, brought her to the cabin, held her there while the searches played out. He'd kept her alive, contained, waiting. For what? We still didn't know. Ransom didn't fit, no demands were ever made. But control fit. Power fit. The ability to make everyone search for someone he had hidden fit. Derek had searched obsessively because he knew something was wrong. But he didn't know what. Not until November 12th. Not until his father told him. The November 13th phone call was the key. 4 minutes. After which, Derek looked at the asbestos assessment schedule. After which, he searched for how to make tips look real. After which, his father drove to the warehouse complex at 11:35 p.m. with something in his trunk. Rachel had been dead approximately 3 weeks when the contractor found her. That timeline started on October 19th, but she'd been alive in the cabin until November 12th. The scratch marks proved it, which meant she'd died that night or early the next morning, which meant Derek had been there when it happened. On November 28th, Derek's lawyer offered a statement. Derek had gone to the cabin on November 12th because his father had called him, frantic, saying Rachel was there, that Martin had been keeping her safe, that he'd been trying to protect her from something he wouldn't explain. When Derek arrived, Rachel was unconscious on the cot. Martin said she'd collapsed, that something was wrong, that they needed to help her. Derek claimed he'd tried to call 911, that Martin had stopped him, said they couldn't involve police, that it would look like kidnapping, that they'd both go to prison. Derek said he'd wanted to take Rachel to a hospital, but Martin had convinced him she was already gone, that they needed to think about what to do. According to Derek's statement, Martin had decided they should put her body somewhere it would be found, but in a way that wouldn't connect back to them. The warehouse complex made sense. It was already associated with the search, already cleared by dogs, unlikely to be checked again soon. Martin had known about the asbestos assessment scheduled for November 14th. He'd known a contractor would be there, would find her, would report it as a tragic discovery in a previously searched location. Derek's statement said he'd helped move her body because he'd been in shock, because his father had convinced him they had no choice, because he'd believed they were protecting themselves from a situation they hadn't created. He claimed he hadn't known his father had taken Rachel, that he'd been searching for her genuinely, that learning the truth had destroyed him. Martin's lawyer offered a different version on November 30th. Martin claimed Derek had called him on October 19th, desperate, saying Rachel had confronted him about something, that things had escalated, that she was hurt, and he didn't know what to do. Martin said he'd gone to help his son, found Rachel injured but alive, brought her to the cabin to keep her safe while they figured out what to do. He said Derek had visited multiple times, that they'd both been trying to decide whether to come forward, or claim it had been an accident, or hope she'd recover enough to explain it herself. Martin said Rachel had died from injuries sustained in the initial confrontation, that by the time they'd realized how serious it was, too much time had passed to report it, without both of them facing charges. He said the warehouse placement had been Derek's idea, that Derek had been the one monitoring the asbestos schedule, that Derek had helped carry her body in the middle of the night on November 13th. Both men blamed the other. Both admitted to moving the body. Both claimed the death had been accidental, or at least unintended. Neither explained why Rachel had been kept in the basement for 3 weeks if the situation had been an accident requiring immediate help. The toxicology results came back on December 2nd. Rachel had died from respiratory failure consistent with suffocation. Not strangulation, no ligature marks, no crushed hyoid bone, but suffocation. Something had covered her nose and mouth long enough to stop her breathing. The timing of death matched November 12th, late evening to early morning November 13th. There were also traces of diazepam in her system, consistent with repeated dosing over multiple days. Someone had been sedating her. The prescription records showed Martin had been prescribed diazepam for anxiety in late September. The bottle was found in the cabin basement, empty, with Rachel's fingerprints on it. The pill count suggested she'd been given doses regularly throughout her captivity. On December 5th, I went back to the warehouse. Bay 7, specifically. I needed to understand the placement. Why that spot? Why positioned the way she'd been? Why face up with her arms at her sides? The forensic photos showed her exactly centered in the bay, equidistant from all walls. She'd been placed, not dropped. The deliberateness bothered me. You don't arrange a body carefully if you're panicking. You don't center it if you're rushing. You do that if you want it found in a specific way, if you're staging something. I measured the sightlines from the loading dock door to her position. From the entrance, with a flashlight, you'd see her immediately. She'd been placed in the exact spot where someone entering the bay would have the clearest view. Not hidden. Not obscured. Displayed. The contractor's statement said he'd entered Bay 7 because his assessment required checking every space. But the door to Bay 7 had been partially blocked by fallen debris. He'd had to move it to get in. That debris had been documented in the October search photos as lying against the door. Someone had moved it after the searches, repositioned it to look natural but with enough clearance for the door to open. Martin and Derek had both been at the warehouse on November 13th, according to the cell tower data. Martin's phone had pinged from 11:35 p.m. to 1:15 a.m. Derek's phone had been off, something neither lawyer had explained. A turned-off phone meant someone who didn't want their location recorded, someone who knew how tracking worked. On December 8th, forensics provided a detail that changed everything. The debris that had blocked Bay 7's door, the debris that had been moved sometime after October 22nd and before November 14th, had transfer evidence on it. Fibers from Martin's jacket caught on a splintered wood pallet. But under those fibers, older and deeper in the wood grain, were fibers from Derek's jacket. Derek had moved that debris first. Martin had moved it second, which meant Derek had been in Bay 7, moving obstacles, before his father arrived with the body. Which meant Derek had prepared the space. Which meant this wasn't a panicked disposal. It was a planned staging. And Derek had been involved in planning it. I brought this to the district attorney on December 10th. She said we had enough for dual prosecution. Murder 2 for both of them. Rachel had been held captive for 3 weeks, sedated, controlled, and ultimately suffocated by one or both of them. Conspiracy, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, obstruction. The evidence web was tight enough that it didn't matter whose exact hand had done what. They'd both participated in every stage. The trial started in March. Both defendants pled not guilty. Both claimed the other had been the primary actor. The prosecution laid out the timeline, the evidence, the phone records, the forensic matches. The basement scratches were blown up on courtroom screens, 22 marks, then 3. 25 days of captivity. 25 days of Rachel knowing she was being held, knowing no one was coming. The defense tried to argue accident, panic, misguided attempts to help. But the diazepam prescription, the basement bars, the careful body placement, the coordinated warehouse timing, none of it supported panic. All of it supported control. The jury took 4 days. They convicted both men on all counts. Martin got life without parole. Derek got 35 to life, eligible for parole in 28 years if he demonstrates rehabilitation. Rachel's family sat through every day of the trial. Carol testified about Rachel's plans, her morning routines, her relationship with Derek. She said Rachel had mentioned feeling like Derek was getting too serious too fast, that she'd been thinking about taking a break, but she'd never said anything about feeling unsafe. After the verdict, I met Carol outside the courthouse. She asked me if I thought Rachel had known, at the end, that Derek was involved, if she'd understood that the person she'd trusted had betrayed her. I said I didn't know. But the scratch marks suggested she'd been keeping count, waiting, hoping, still thinking someone would search correctly, that someone would check the places that made sense. She couldn't have known that the people searching for her were the same people who'd taken her. The case files closed in April. But there are still pieces that don't fit cleanly. Martin's initial motive, why he'd taken Rachel in the first place, never became clear. His statement claimed he'd been helping Derek after an accident. But the basement preparation, the bars, the supplies, suggested planning. Those bars were installed on October 20th, the day after Rachel disappeared. You don't install bars on a window well to help with an accident. You install them to keep someone contained. The prosecution's theory was that Martin had taken Rachel to manipulate Derek, or to punish him, or as some twisted attempt to control his son's life. Derek's deteriorating mental state during the searches, his obsessive warehouse visits, his apparent desperation, all of it could have been genuine response to his father's actions. Or it could have been performance, covering for his own involvement from the start. I've gone back to the November 13th phone call transcript, obtained through warrant after the arrests. 4 minutes. Derek called Martin at 7:20 p.m. The call connected, voices audible in the background recording pulled from Martin's phone provider. Derek, we need to finish this. Martin, I know. Derek, tonight. Martin, I'll take care of it. Derek. Both of us. Then silence until Martin, the contractor, comes Thursday morning. Derek, I'll check the schedule. Martin, don't call again. Finish this doesn't sound like discovering a captive you didn't know about. Both of us doesn't sound like being told your father has committed a crime without your knowledge. The call suggested coordination that had been ongoing, decisions that had already been made, a plan that was reaching its conclusion. Rachel's phone was never recovered. Neither was her jogging watch, her house keys, or the small backpack she'd carried with her ID and water bottle. We searched Martin's house, Derek's apartment, the cabin, the warehouse. Those items disappeared completely, like they'd never existed. Either they were destroyed immediately on October 19th, or they're still hidden somewhere, in a location neither man will reveal. The scratch marks haunt me. 22 days of marking time, then 3 more. November 9th to November 12th. Something changed on the 9th. The pattern shifted from daily marks in a tight cluster to marks that were more spaced, less regular. Like she'd been losing strength. Or losing hope, or being sedated more heavily. November 12th was the night Derek visited the cabin, according to his lawyer's statement. The night he claimed he'd found her unconscious. If the scratch marks stopped on the 12th, it meant she'd died that night. It meant Derek had been there when she'd made her last mark. It meant he'd seen her alive, seen her conscious, and within hours she'd stopped breathing. The medical examiner's report noted bruising on Rachel's upper arms consistent with restraint. Fresh bruising, perimortem, meaning it happened at or near the time of death. Someone had held her arms down. The positioning suggested she'd been on her back. Someone pinning her arms to her sides, something covering her face. You don't suffocate by accident while unconscious. Suffocation requires sustained pressure, deliberate prevention of breathing, maintained force until the body stops fighting. The trial evidence included a pillow from the cabin basement cot. Forensic testing found Rachel's DNA on one side and microscopic fibers transferred from clothing on the other side. Those fibers matched a jacket Derek owned. A jacket he'd claimed he hadn't worn to the cabin that night. A jacket he'd said he'd left at home. But his home search had found that jacket in a garbage bag in his closet, rolled up like he'd meant to throw it away, but hadn't gotten around to it. Martin's story claimed Derek had called him after finding Rachel unresponsive. But Derek's phone records showed no outgoing calls on November 12th after his 7:20 p.m. call to Martin. If Rachel had collapsed suddenly and Derek had panicked, there should have been calls to Martin, to 911, to someone. Instead, there was silence until Martin's phone started moving toward the cabin around 11 p.m. The timeline that makes sense, the one that fits all the evidence but wasn't fully proven at trial, is this. Martin took Rachel on October 19th for reasons that remain unclear. Held her in the cabin basement while the searches played out, sedated her to keep her compliant. Derek knew, or suspected, but did nothing, either because he was afraid of his father, or because he was complicit from the start. On November 9th, something changed. Maybe Rachel became harder to control. Maybe she'd stopped eating. Maybe the sedation was causing medical issues. Martin and Derek talked, decided this couldn't continue. They made a plan. On November 12th, Derek went to the cabin. Maybe they'd both been there regularly, and he'd been involved in her captivity all along. Maybe this was his first visit, and he was confronting the reality of what his father had done. Either way, that night, Rachel died. Whether Derek held the pillow or Martin did, or whether they both participated, the result was the same. Respiratory failure. Suffocation. Murder. Then they moved her, carefully, deliberately, to a place where she'd be found but couldn't be connected back to them. The warehouse that had already been searched. The bay that had been cleared twice. The perfect spot where her appearance would seem like a tragic search failure, not a calculated placement. They almost got away with it. If the contractor had found her, and the case had closed as found deceased, previously searched location. If the dust patterns hadn't been preserved in photographs. If I hadn't pushed for enhanced imaging. If Derek hadn't kept accessing that volunteer coordination page. If Martin's phone hadn't pinged those cell towers, they might have walked away. Rachel would have been another tragedy. A search that failed. A body that was missed. The family would have grieved without ever knowing it was murder. But the details add up. They always do, eventually. You can stage a scene, you can control a timeline, you can coordinate a story. But you can't erase fiber transfers. You can't fake cell tower pings. You can't explain away scratch marks that count the days of someone's captivity. Carol asked me, at the end, if I thought Rachel suffered. I told her what I tell every family I don't know. But I do know. 25 days in a basement, sedated, restrained, marked off like a calendar by fingernails on drywall. She suffered. She knew she'd been taken. She knew she was being held. She knew, at the end, that the person she'd trusted was part of it. The warehouse still stands empty. Building 3, Day 7. I drove past it last month. Someone had spray-painted a memorial on the loading dock door. Rachel's name. A date never forgotten. The chain-link fence is still cut in places. The dust inside probably still holds faint impressions of the last time someone walked through. I don't take cold cases anymore. After Rachel, after watching 2 men lie their way through a trial, while a family sat 3 rows back, learning exactly how their daughter died, I requested reassignment. But I still think about the searches. About the dogs circling Building 3, reacting to something that wasn't there yet. About the search teams photographing an empty bay that would, 3 weeks later, hold a body. About Derek walking through that same bay on November 12th, preparing the space, moving the debris, setting the stage. And I think about the scratch marks. 22 in one cluster, then 3 more. 25 days. Not knowing that the person you loved, the person who should have been looking for you, was counting down the same days for a different reason, waiting not for rescue but for the moment when you'd become too difficult to keep alive. The case is closed. Both men are in prison. Rachel's family has what passes for justice in these situations. But the questions remain. Why Martin took her initially, whether Derek knew from the start, what they'd planned to do if she'd never become a problem, whether they'd have kept her in that basement indefinitely, visiting with supplies and sedatives, maintaining a captivity that could have lasted months or years. Some cases answer themselves cleanly. The evidence tells a story, the story explains the motive justifies the resolution. This case doesn't have that clarity. We know what they did. We know they did it together. We know Rachel marked 25 days before she died, but we don't know why it started. And that absence of motive, that missing piece at the beginning, means somewhere in the evidence we have, there's still a detail we haven't understood. A reason that connects everything. A truth that Martin and Derek both know, and neither will speak. The volunteer coordination page is still online, frozen as a memorial. The search grid maps are still posted. Building 3 still shows as cleared on October 21st and 22nd. If you didn't know what happened after, you'd read those updates and think the searches were thorough, professional, complete. You'd never guess that the building marked clear would become a crime scene 3 weeks later. You'd never imagine someone was counting days in a basement while search teams walked past above ground. That's the part that stays with me. Not the murder itself, not the trial, not even the convictions. It's the scratches on the wall. 22 marks, then 3. A count kept by someone who still believed the numbers mattered, who still thought rescue was possible, who didn't know the searches had already ended, and the people who might have saved her had decided not to. I left the district attorney's office in May and moved to a position reviewing cold cases for pattern analysis. The work is quieter, more removed. I look at files from decades past, searching for connections between unsolved incidents, building timelines that might reveal serial activity or jurisdictional gaps that allowed someone to operate undetected. It's forensic work without the field work, investigation without the interviews. I don't have to look at families anymore and explain why the person they trusted turned out to be the person who hurt them. But Rachel's case follows me. Not in nightmares or flashbacks. I've worked enough violent cases that the details themselves don't shock me anymore. What follows me is the operational question. The planning element. Martin prepared that basement on October 20th, the day after Rachel disappeared. He installed bars on a window well that had been open for years. He brought in supplies, bottled water, non-perishable food, a cot, blankets, a battery-powered lantern. He created a containment space in less than 24 hours. That level of preparation doesn't happen spontaneously. You don't wake up the morning after abducting someone and suddenly decide to fortify a basement. You plan it beforehand. Or you've thought about it long enough that execution becomes simple. Which means one of two things. Either Martin had been planning to take someone, maybe Rachel specifically, maybe anyone who fit a certain profile, or he'd prepared that space for a different purpose entirely, and Rachel became an opportunistic target. The prosecution argued premeditation based on the bars, the supplies, the timing. But they never established why Rachel, why that morning, that route, that that specific person. Derek's relationship with her provided a connection, but Martin had no known interaction with Rachel before October 19th. He'd met her twice, both times briefly at family events Derek had hosted. She wasn't someone Martin knew well enough to harbor a grudge against, to fantasize about, to target specifically, unless the target was always Derek. And Rachel was the mechanism. I've gone back through Martin's history, looking for patterns. He was 61 at the time of arrest, retired from a 30-year career in HVAC installation and repair, divorced twice, both marriages ending in his 30s. One son from the first marriage, Derek. No other children. No criminal record beyond a DUI in his 20s. Neighbors described him as quiet, kept to himself, maintained his property, but didn't socialize. The cabin had been in his family since the 70s, inherited from his father. He'd spent weekends there regularly, used it for hunting season, occasional fishing. Nothing in his background suggested violent tendencies or prior offenses. But absence of a record isn't absence of behavior. It just means no one reported it, or no one believed it, or no one had enough evidence to pursue it. I requested Martin's employment records and found something interesting. Over 30 years, he'd been fired 3 times and quit 7 times. For someone in a stable trade, that's unusual. HVAC work is steady, well-paying, always in demand. You don't bounce between 10 different employers unless something is wrong. I contacted former employers who were still operating. Most didn't remember him or declined to comment. But one, a small residential company he'd worked for in the early 2000s, had records of a complaint. A homeowner had reported that Martin had returned to her house after completing a furnace repair, claiming he'd left a tool behind. She'd let him in, he'd gone to the basement, stayed longer than necessary. She'd felt uncomfortable. Called the company, asked that he not be sent back. The company had noted the complaint, reassigned her account, but hadn't fired him. 6 months later, he'd quit. I found 2 more similar incidents in other employment records. Complaints about lingering too long in basements, returning to job sites without clear reason, making homeowners uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. None rose to the level of criminal behavior. None involved threats or explicit misconduct. Just a pattern of boundary violations, of accessing spaces he shouldn't have been in, of creating unease. Basements. Every complaint involved basements. Martin's cabin basement wasn't a spur-of-the-moment choice. It was a location he'd been thinking about for years, a type of space he'd been drawn to professionally and personally. The bars on the window well, the supplies, the containment setup, those weren't new ideas. They were refinements of something he'd been conceptualizing for a long time. Which brings me back to Derek, the son who'd grown up visiting that cabin, who'd spent weekends there as a child, who knew the basement as well as Martin did. The son who, according to his own testimony, hadn't been to the cabin in over a year before November 12th. But cell records show his phone pinging towers near the cabin on October 27th, November 3rd, and November 10th. 3 visits he never mentioned. 3 trips that happened while Rachel was being held in that basement. The prosecution presented those pings at trial as evidence of Derek's involvement. The defense argued they were evidence of Derek checking on his father, worried about his mental state, unaware of what was happening in the basement. But if Derek had been to the cabin 3 times and never gone downstairs, never noticed the bars on the window well, never heard anything from the basement, that level of deliberate avoidance suggests knowledge, not ignorance. I think Derek knew from the beginning. I think Martin told him or showed him or involved him immediately. I think the entire 25 days Derek was participating, bringing supplies, helping with sedation, coordinating the cover story. I think his visible distress during the searches was genuine, not because he feared Rachel was dead, but because he feared Rachel would be found alive. The volunteer coordination page activity supports this. Derek accessed it obsessively, tracking exactly where searches were happening, which buildings had been cleared, which areas were still pending. He wasn't looking for Rachel. He was making sure no one was getting too close to the cabin, that no search teams were expanding into rural properties, that the focus stayed urban. Every time a search moved toward the county's unincorporated areas, Derek posted updates redirecting volunteers back to the industrial zone, back to the parks, back to the areas he knew were safe. On November 8th, a volunteer had suggested expanding to weekend cabin properties, arguing that Rachel might have been taken to a secondary location. Derek had responded within minutes, dismissing the idea as too broad, not evidence-based, a waste of limited resources. He'd posted a detailed argument about probability maps and likely abduction scenarios, all designed to keep searches away from rural areas. The volunteer had backed down. The cabin expansion never happened. November 8th was 4 days before Rachel died. 4 days before Derek visited the cabin on November 12th, and she stopped scratching marks. If searches had expanded to cabins, if someone had knocked on Martin's door and asked to look around, Rachel might have been found alive. Derek's redirect kept that from happening. He didn't just fail to save her. He actively prevented her rescue. The jury convicted him of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and second-degree murder. But the charge should have been first degree. The November 8th post alone demonstrates premeditation and deliberate action to ensure the victim's continued captivity. The prosecution tried to argue it, but the defense successfully framed it as Derek trying to keep searches organized and efficient, not realizing his suggestions were helping his father. The jury couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Derek knew Rachel was at the cabin when he made those posts. But I know. Anyone who works cases like this knows. You don't coincidentally redirect searches away from the exact location where the victim is being held. You don't coincidentally access the coordination page at the exact moments when someone suggests expanding the search area. You don't coincidentally visit your father's cabin 3 times during the victim's captivity and never notice anything wrong. Derek's phone records show one more detail the trial didn't emphasize enough. On October 19th, the day Rachel disappeared, Derek's phone was off from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. He claimed he'd been sleeping, had forgotten to charge it overnight, had woken up to a dead battery. But his phone had been active until 11 p.m. the night before, and showed 93% charge at that time. A phone at 93% doesn't die overnight unless someone turns it off deliberately. Rachel disappeared between 6:30 and 7 a.m. Derek's phone was off. Martin's phone pinged a tower near Rachel's jogging route at 6:40 a.m., then pinged a tower near the cabin at 8:15 a.m. The timeline fits perfectly if you assume they worked together. Martin grabbed Rachel during her jog. Derek stayed off-grid to avoid any electronic connection. Martin transported her to the cabin, while Derek maintained his alibi of being asleep at home. When Derek's phone came back online at 10 a.m., his first call was to Martin. 3 minutes. Then another call at 10:30, 2 minutes. Then Derek started calling Rachel's phone, leaving voicemails, sending texts, creating a record of concern, building the worried boyfriend narrative. I've listened to those voicemails. They're available as trial evidence, played in court to establish Derek's behavior. The first one at 10:40 a.m. Hey, just woke up, wondering if you want to grab breakfast. Call me back. Casual, light, normal. The second one at 11:20 a.m. Hey, getting a little worried, you're usually up by now. Let me know you're okay. Slight concern, still controlled. The third one at 12:15 p.m. Rachel, seriously, call me. I'm starting to freak out. Where are you? Escalation, panic, creeping in. But here's what bothers me. The third voicemail has background noise, traffic sounds, a horn, voices. Derek wasn't at home when he left that message. His phone pinged a tower near the industrial district, near the area where Rachel's body would eventually be found. At 12:15 p.m. on October 19th, less than 6 hours after Rachel disappeared, Derek was already at the warehouse district. Not searching. The official searches didn't start until that evening. Just there. In the location where, 3 weeks later, he and Martin would place her body. The prosecution argued Derek was searching on his own, checking places Rachel might have gone. But Rachel had no connection to that warehouse district. She'd never worked there, never jogged there, never mentioned it. It was 20 minutes from her apartment in the opposite direction of her usual routes. There's no logical reason Derek would have checked there on day one, unless he already knew it mattered. I think Derek and Martin visited the warehouse on October 19th, scouting the location, planning ahead. I think they knew from the moment they took Rachel that they'd eventually need a place to put her body. I think they chose Building 3. Bay 7, that first day, marked it mentally and returned on November 13th to execute a plan they'd been refining for nearly a month. The dust patterns support this. Enhanced imaging showed faint impressions consistent with foot traffic on November 13th, but also older impressions that the initial photography had been too low resolution to detect. When the images were reprocessed with better algorithms, those older impressions became visible. 2 sets of prints, both consistent with adult male shoes, dated by dust accumulation to approximately 3 to 4 weeks before the body was found, which means someone had been in that bay in mid to late October, walking the space, checking sightlines, confirming it was still abandoned. Those prints were never conclusively matched to Derek or Martin, because the resolution wasn't sufficient for individual tread comparison. But the size and stride patterns were consistent with both men. And the timing was consistent with October 19th, the day Derek's phone pinged near the warehouse district, the day he left a voicemail with background traffic noise while standing somewhere he had no reason to be. The case I can prove is strong enough for conviction. The case I know happened is darker. Rachel didn't disappear into random violence. She was selected, taken, and held by two people who'd planned her captivity and her disposal with methodical precision. The scratches on the wall weren't marks of hope. They were marks of someone slowly realizing that no one was coming, that the searches were happening in all the wrong places, that the boyfriend organizing those searches knew exactly where she was and wasn't telling anyone. Carol asked me once if I thought Rachel had suspected Derek. If, during those 25 days, she'd figured out that he was involved. I said I didn't know. But the scratch marks tell me something. They're grouped in clusters of 5, like someone counting. Like someone keeping track methodically, almost obsessively. That's not the behavior of someone who's given up. That's someone who's still thinking, still planning, still believing information matters. I think Rachel was documenting her captivity. I think she knew or suspected that Derek was part of it, and she wanted to leave a record. 25 marks, 25 days, concrete evidence that she'd been held somewhere for nearly a month. If she'd been found alive, those marks would have corroborated her account, would have proven duration of captivity, would have established that this wasn't a brief abduction, but an extended imprisonment. She couldn't have known that she'd never get to testify. That the marks would end up being evidence in a murder trial instead of a rescue. That the count she was keeping would become the primary proof of how long she'd suffered before someone decided she was too much trouble to keep alive. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I attended every day of Martin's trial, most days of Derek's. The courtroom was packed initially, media, true crime enthusiasts, Rachel's family and friends. By week 3, it was mostly empty except for the families and a few dedicated reporters. Trials are tedious. Hours of technical testimony, procedural arguments, evidence authentication. The dramatic moments you see in movies are rare and brief. Martin's defense was insanity. His attorney argued diminished capacity, brought in a psychologist who testified about delusional thinking and dissociative episodes. The psychologist claimed Martin had experienced a psychotic break, had convinced himself that Rachel wanted to be there, that he was protecting her from some imagined threat. The testimony was detailed and mostly nonsense. Martin had been functional enough to maintain his HVAC business, pay his bills, communicate normally with clients and colleagues. He hadn't shown signs of psychosis in any other area of his life. The delusion was selective, convenient, and transparently fabricated for the trial. The prosecution dismantled it efficiently. They presented the supplies Martin had purchased: sedatives, restraints, soundproofing foam. They showed receipts dating back to September, a month before Rachel disappeared. They demonstrated premeditation through a timeline of purchases that showed systematic preparation, not sudden impulse. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and convicted Martin on all counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. He'll die in prison. He's 68 now, in poor health, unlikely to live another decade. Derek's trial was more complicated. The evidence against him was circumstantial. Phone pings, coordination page activity, the November 12th visit. No physical evidence placed him in the basement with Rachel. No witness testimony confirmed his involvement. The prosecution's case relied on the accumulation of suspicious behavior, the pattern of coincidences that were too precise to be accidental. Derek's defense was more sophisticated than Martin's. His attorney didn't deny that Derek's behavior looked bad. Instead, he reframed it. Derek had been manipulated by his father, controlled through lifelong psychological abuse, conditioned to obey without questioning. The November 12th visit, Martin had called Derek, said he needed help with something urgent. Derek had driven to the cabin out of habitual compliance. The coordination page activity? Derek had been genuinely trying to organize searches effectively, had trusted his father's suggestions about where Rachel might be. The October 19th phone-off period? Derek had been depressed, had turned off his phone to avoid social interaction, a coping mechanism he'd used before during stressful periods. The defense brought in Derek's childhood friends, teachers, former girlfriends. They testified about Martin's controlling behavior, his explosive temper, his expectations of absolute obedience. They painted Derek as a victim himself, someone who'd spent his entire life under Martin's dominance, who'd been groomed to assist without understanding what he was assisting with. It was compelling. I watched the jury respond to it. Several jurors were nodding during the defense's closing argument. They wanted to believe Derek was redeemable, that he'd been corrupted by a monstrous father rather than being monstrous himself. But the prosecution had one piece of evidence that cut through the sympathy. On November 10th, 2 days before Rachel died, Derek had searched online for how long can someone survive without food. He'd visited 3 different medical websites, reading articles about starvation timelines, metabolic shutdown, organ failure. The search history was recovered from his laptop, time-stamped at 11 p.m. on November 10th. The defense argued it was Derek researching his father's health, worried about Martin's recent weight loss and poor appetite. But the prosecution pointed out that the searches were specifically about survival without food, not about appetite loss or malnutrition. They were about how long a captive could be sustained, how long before death became inevitable. 2 days later, Derek visited the cabin. 2 days after that visit, Rachel stopped scratching marks. The jury convicted Derek of second-degree murder, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to 40 years. With good behavior, he'll be eligible for parole in 25. He'll be 52 years old. Young enough to have a life afterward, if the parole board grants it. Carol doesn't think he should ever be released. She's already preparing for the parole hearing 25 years in advance. She's documenting everything, saving articles, keeping records. She told me she'll be there at every hearing, testifying against his release, reminding the board what he did. I believe her. Grief like hers doesn't fade. It calcifies into something harder. The warehouse district is still abandoned. Building 3 was demolished 2 years after the trial, part of a city redevelopment project that ultimately stalled due to funding issues. The entire block is now a fenced-off lot, overgrown with weeds, graffiti on the remaining walls. I drove past it last month. Someone had left flowers near the fence, a small bouquet wrapped in cellophane, wilting in the rain. I don't know who left them. Carol doesn't visit the site. She says it's not where Rachel is, it's just where her body was found. And those are different things. Martin's cabin was sold at auction. A developer bought the property, tore down the cabin, subdivided the lot. It's now 2 parcels, one with a prefab vacation home, the other still empty. The new owner didn't know the cabin's history when he purchased it. When he found out, he tried to back out of the sale, but the auction terms were final. He ended up building the vacation home anyway, rents it out on short-term rental sites. I've seen the listing. It advertises peaceful wooded seclusion, perfect for digital detox, reconnect with nature. The reviews mention how quiet it is at night, how isolated, how far from everything. Guests love it. They have no idea what happened 50 yards away, beneath the structure that used to stand there. The rental listing includes photos, wide-angle shots of the interior, the deck, the surrounding woods. In one photo, if you know where to look, you can see the corner of the old foundation, still visible through the underbrush. The window well is gone, filled in and covered, but the concrete pad where it was located is still there, a slightly darker rectangle in the soil. I doubt anyone notices it. It looks like a garden bed or an old shed foundation. Just another piece of a property's history, meaningless to anyone who doesn't know what to look for. I think about that a lot. How places hold history invisibly. How violence happens in locations that later become normal again. How the worst moments of someone's life can occur in a space that other people later walk through without feeling anything. Building 3, Bay 7 had been Rachel's tomb, but before that it had been a loading dock where workers had moved shipping pallets and taken lunch breaks and complained about their supervisors. After her body was removed, it went back to being empty space. Then rubble, then a vacant lot where weeds grow. The cabin basement where Rachel spent 25 days scratching marks into concrete is now buried under fill dirt and a vacation home foundation. People sleep above it, drink coffee on the deck above it, take photos in the woods around it. None of them feel the weight of what happened there, because place doesn't retain memory. Only people do. And most people don't know, or don't care, or don't want to think about it. I still have the case file. 3 banker's boxes in my home office, organized chronologically. I've thought about donating them to an archive or a true crime research library, but I haven't. I keep thinking I might need to reference something, might find a detail I missed. But the truth is, I've been through every document dozens of times. There's nothing left to find. The case is solved. The convictions are final. Appeals have been exhausted. Legally, it's over. But cases like this don't end cleanly. They echo. I still get messages from people who've heard about Rachel's case, asking questions, proposing theories. suggesting I missed something. Some are true crime hobbyists looking for podcast material. Some are conspiracy theorists convinced there's a larger network, that Martin and Derek were part of something bigger. Some are well-meaning people who just want to understand how something like this happens, how two people can collaborate in such prolonged cruelty. I don't usually respond. What is there to say? The evidence is public. The trial transcripts are available. The facts are documented. If people want answers, the answers exist. But what they're really asking for isn't information. It's meaning. They want to know why. They want the motivation to make sense, to fit into a framework they can understand. The problem is, it doesn't make sense. Not in a way that's satisfying. Martin was a man with a history of boundary violations who finally escalated to kidnapping. Derek was a son who chose loyalty to his father over morality. That's the explanation. There's no hidden complexity, no elaborate backstory that redeems or explains their actions. They wanted to hurt someone, and they did, and they tried to get away with it. That's the entire story. The only mystery left is how many others there might have been. Martin is 68. He's been alive and mobile for decades. The pattern of behavior, basement access, boundary violations, professional mobility goes back 30 years in employment records. It's possible Rachel was the first, that decades of ideation finally escalated to action. But it's also possible she wasn't. I've looked into cold cases in areas where Martin worked. Disappearances of young women between the late 1990s and 2015, unsolved abductions with no clear suspect. There are 6 cases within 50 miles of locations where Martin held employment. None of them have evidence linking to Martin. None of them have basement involvement or similar MO characteristics. But absence of connection isn't proof of innocence. It just means I haven't found the link yet. Carol thinks I should let it go. She's told me that searching for additional victims won't bring Rachel back, won't change the sentences, won't accomplish anything except prolonging my own involvement in the case. She's probably right. But I can't quite drop it. 6 unsolved cases, 6 families still waiting for answers. If there's even a chance Martin was involved, I owe it to them to keep looking. The hardest one to let go of is Stephanie Orr. Disappeared in 2008, 26 years old, worked as a dental hygienist. Last seen leaving her apartment for a morning jog. Sound familiar? Stephanie jogged the same route every day. Left between 6:30 and 7 a.m. Ran a 5-mile loop through residential streets. She vanished on April 12th, 2008. Her body was found 3 weeks later in a storage facility. Similar circumstances to Rachel. Secured location. Evidence of extended captivity. Cause of death hypothermia and starvation. Martin worked for a heating and cooling company in Stephanie's city from 2006 to 2009. His employment records show service calls in Stephanie's neighborhood. I've requested the company's full client list for that period. But the company went out of business in 2010 and records weren't preserved. I've tried to track down the former owner, but he passed away in 2016. The employees I've managed to locate don't remember specific service calls from 14 years ago. Without physical evidence or witness testimony linking Martin to Stephanie's case, there's nothing actionable. The detective who worked Stephanie's disappearance is retired now, living in Florida. I called him last year, explained my theory. He was polite, but skeptical. Stephanie's case had a suspect, an ex-boyfriend with a history of domestic violence who'd been harassing her before she disappeared. The ex had an alibi for the day of the abduction, but the detective always believed the alibi was fabricated, that the ex had somehow been involved. The detective spent years trying to break the alibi, never succeeded. He's convinced the ex did it, that Martin's proximity is coincidental. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, trying to connect cases that aren't connected. But the similarities bother me. Morning jogger, extended captivity, death by environmental exposure in a secured location. That's not a common MO. Most abductions that result in murder involve quicker deaths, strangulation, blunt force trauma, gunshot. Extended captivity is rare. Death by starvation and hypothermia is even rarer. 2 cases with that specific combination, both in cities where Martin was employed, both victims matching Rachel's demographic, young, athletic, routine morning joggers. I've asked Martin about it. I've visited him twice in prison, both times requesting interviews. He refused the first time. The second time he agreed to meet but wouldn't answer questions. He sat across from me in the visitor's room, silent, staring at the table. I laid out photos of the 6 cold cases, asked if he recognized any of the victims. He didn't look at the photos. After 15 minutes, he stood up and left. The guard told me Martin had been like that since his incarceration, minimally communicative, withdrawn, refusing psychological evaluation. Derek has been more communicative but equally unhelpful. He's granted 3 interviews to journalists, all of which have been published. In each interview, he maintains that he didn't know Rachel was in the cabin, that his father manipulated him, that he's haunted by guilt over not realizing what was happening. He's expressed remorse, apologized to Carol and Rachel's family, claimed he thinks about Rachel every day. But he's never provided additional information. He's never admitted to more involvement than what the trial proved. He's never mentioned other victims or suggested Martin had done this before. If Derek knows about previous cases, he's keeping that information to himself, which makes sense strategically. Admitting knowledge of other victims would undermine his defense that he was an unknowing pawn in his father's actions. I've written to Derek twice, asking directly if Martin had ever mentioned prior abductions or showed interest in other women. Derek didn't respond to either letter. His attorney sent a brief reply stating that Derek has said everything he intends to say about the case and won't be participating in further investigations or interviews. So the 6 cold cases remain cold. Stephanie Orr and 5 others, their families still waiting, their cases still open but inactive. I've submitted Martin's information to the departments handling each case, flagged him as a person of interest, provided employment records and timeline overlaps. None of the departments have pursued it actively. Without new evidence, there's nothing to investigate. Martin's conviction for Rachel's murder doesn't create probable cause for other cases. The legal system doesn't work that way. But I know how patterns work. I know how predators escalate. I know that men like Martin don't usually start with a perfect execution. They make mistakes, learn, refine. Rachel's abduction was too smooth, too well planned. The cabin was too prepared. The coordination page manipulation was too sophisticated. That level of control suggests experience, practice, prior iterations. If Martin did this before, he got away with it. Multiple times. And Derek might have been involved in those cases too. Might have been assisting his father for years before Rachel. The psychological control Derek's defense described, that doesn't develop overnight. That's the result of long-term conditioning, of a relationship where collaboration in horrible acts became normalized over time. I think about Derek's childhood friends, the ones who testified about Martin's controlling behavior. None of them mentioned anything overtly criminal, but several mentioned that Derek wasn't allowed to have friends over to the cabin, that Martin kept that property private, that Derek himself seemed uncomfortable when people asked about it. One friend testified that Derek had once said the cabin wasn't a fun place, that he didn't like going there, that his father made him. How old was Derek when that dynamic started? When did weekend trips to the cabin shift from father-son bonding to something darker? At what point did Derek realize his father was using the cabin for something wrong? And at what point did he decide to help instead of report it? Those questions don't have answers. Derek was 18 when the earliest concerning employment complaints about Martin were filed. If Martin's behavior started earlier than that, Derek would have been a minor, possibly a victim himself, before becoming a participant. The defense hinted at this, suggested that Derek had been groomed into compliance from a young age. But they never provided specific evidence of abuse, never claimed Martin had harmed Derek directly. What they described was psychological control, but psychological control has to be enforced somehow, either through fear, through reward, or through shared culpability. If Martin involved Derek in prior abductions, that shared culpability would be the strongest control mechanism possible. Derek couldn't report his father without implicating himself. The more involved Derek became, the more trapped he was. That's speculation. But it's informed speculation based on decades of studying family-involved crimes. Abduction and murder aren't typically collaborative unless the collaborators are bound by something stronger than ordinary loyalty. Spouses collaborate because of shared psychological disorders or mutual dependence. Parents and children collaborate because the child has been raised in an environment where the criminal behavior is normalized, or because the child is coerced through fear of violence. Derek doesn't fit the profile of someone raised in an environment where kidnapping was normalized. He had friends, attended public school, held jobs, maintained relationships. He functioned normally in society, which suggests the coercion was more subtle. Perhaps threats, perhaps manipulation, perhaps the slow accumulation of small complicit acts that gradually escalated until Derek was too deep to extract himself. Or maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Maybe Derek was simply willing. Maybe he helped his father because he wanted to, because he enjoyed it, because he shared Martin's desires and saw an opportunity to act on them without solo risk. The prosecution argued this at trial, that Derek wasn't a victim, he was a partner. That his visible distress during the searches was about getting caught, not about Rachel's suffering. I go back and forth. Some days I think Derek is redeemable, that he made terrible choices under terrible influence, but retains some capacity for genuine remorse. Other days I listen to the voicemails he left on Rachel's phone, hear the practiced concern, remember the coordination page redirects, and think he's exactly as culpable as his father. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Derek is both victim and perpetrator, both manipulated and willing, both coerced and complicit. Human behavior isn't binary. People can be multiple things simultaneously, afraid and cruel, controlled and choosing, trapped and active. What matters legally is that Derek had agency. He was an adult. He had opportunities to report, to intervene, to walk away. He chose not to. Whatever psychological factors influenced that choice, the choice itself was his. And Rachel died because of it. Carol has never wavered on this. She holds Derek fully responsible. She's rejected every interview request from journalists exploring Derek's defense, every documentary pitch examining his psychological state. She's told me she doesn't care why Derek did it. She cares that he did it. That Rachel suffered because of his actions. That he let her die when he could have saved her. I understand her position. But I also think understanding why matters, not for Derek's sake, but for prevention. If we can identify how someone like Derek gets drawn into collaborative violence, we can potentially intervene earlier in similar cases. We can recognize warning signs, disrupt grooming patterns, offer exit paths before escalation. That's the work I'm focused on now. I've consulted on 4 cases in the past 2 years where family members were suspected of collaborating in abductions or murders. In 2 of those cases, we identified the secondary participant early enough to flip them, to offer immunity in exchange for testimony against the primary perpetrator. Both cases resulted in convictions and rescued victims. In the other 2 cases, the secondary participants refused to cooperate. One is serving 20 years. The other is still at large. We know who he is. We know he helped his brother abduct and transport victims. But we can't prove it, beyond reasonable doubt. He's living freely, probably still dangerous, possibly still assisting his brother remotely. The brother is in prison, but he has regular phone access, regular visitors. We monitor the calls, watch the visitors, but we haven't caught anything actionable yet. That's the reality of this work. Some cases resolve cleanly. Most don't. Justice is incomplete. Families are left with partial answers. Perpetrators serve time but don't provide full disclosure. Secondary participants slip through gaps in evidence. Cold cases stay cold. Rachel's case is one of the rare clear resolutions. We know who took her. We know where she was held. We know how she died. We know the timeline. Both perpetrators are in prison. Carol has closure, as much as closure exists in cases like this. But even with resolution, the case haunts me. The scratches on the wall, the 25 marks. the evidence of Rachel's consciousness during her captivity, her awareness that time was passing, her methodical documentation of each day. She knew she was trapped. She knew no one was coming. And she kept counting anyway, kept marking days, kept leaving evidence. That kind of determination, that refusal to give up even when hope is gone, that's what stays with me. Rachel fought until she couldn't fight anymore. She documented her captivity until she was too weak to scratch concrete. She left us a record of her suffering so we'd know, so we'd understand, so the truth couldn't be hidden. The least I can do is make sure that truth is told, make sure her case is remembered accurately, make sure Derek and Martin's actions are documented fully, make sure the 6 cold cases are kept active, kept visible, kept in the minds of investigators who might one day find the connection I haven't. That's why I still have the boxes, why I still review the files, why I can't quite let go. Rachel marked 25 days on a concrete wall so we'd know. I owe her the effort of knowing everything else too. The breakthrough on Stephanie Orr's case came from an unexpected source. Not from my investigation, not from police work, but from a demolition crew. In March 2023, a property development company purchased a large tract of land outside Bend, Oregon. The land had been industrial, a former lumber processing facility that had been abandoned since the early 2000s. The company planned to clear the site and build mixed-use residential and retail space. Standard demolition project, nothing unusual. The crew started with the outbuildings, storage sheds, equipment garages, a small office structure. In the 3rd week of demolition, they brought down an old maintenance shed at the far edge of the property, away from the main facility. The shed was concrete block construction, single room, maybe 15 by 20 feet. When the walls came down, the crew found something underneath the concrete floor. A crawl space, accessible through a hatch that had been concealed under a workbench bolted to the floor. The hatch led down to a space about 4 feet deep, extending under the entire shed footprint. And in that crawl space, they found remains. The medical examiner identified skeletal remains of 3 individuals, all female. All showed evidence of perimortem trauma consistent with blunt force head injuries. All had been in the crawl space for more than a decade, based on decomposition and insect activity analysis. Dental records identified one of the victims as Stephanie Orr. The other 2 remain unidentified. Neither matches any missing persons reports from the Pacific Northwest during the relevant time period. Forensic anthropology suggests both were in their 20s or 30s at time of death. One showed evidence of healed fractures, consistent with prior domestic violence. The other had extensive dental work, expensive cosmetic procedures, suggesting middle to upper income background. The shed had been owned by the lumber company until 2009, when the company went bankrupt and the property was sold to a holding company. Between 2006 and 2009, the lumber company had contracted maintenance to an outside service provider. That service provider was the HVAC company that employed Martin. Martin's employment records show he had access to the property. He'd done service calls at the main facility and had been given a master key to all outbuildings for emergency after-hours repairs. The shed where the remains were found was listed in company records as a maintenance equipment storage location. Martin would have had legitimate reason to be there, legitimate access, no questions asked. The timeline fits. Stephanie disappeared in 2008. The shed was in active use by the lumber company until 2009, when the bankruptcy happened and the property was abandoned. After abandonment, the property sat empty for 14 years, the shed undisturbed until demolition. Dental records conclusively identify Stephanie. The other two victims, we don't know who they are yet. DNA analysis is underway. We're running the profiles through national databases, checking against unidentified remains from other jurisdictions, looking for familial matches. But so far, nothing. Which means 2 women were murdered and buried, and nobody reported them missing. That's unusual, but not impossible. Victims with unstable housing, estranged from family, involved in sex work or substance abuse, they can disappear without generating missing persons reports, or they might have been reported in jurisdictions that didn't enter the data into national databases properly. Or they might have been reported under different names, married names, maiden names, aliases. We're working it. But identification takes time. What we know for certain is that Martin killed at least 4 people. Rachel, Stephanie, and 2 unidentified victims. The MO varies. Rachel died of starvation and hypothermia after extended captivity. Stephanie and the others died of blunt force trauma and were buried immediately. That suggests evolution, experimentation. The early kills were impulsive, violent, disposal-focused. The later kill, Rachel, was controlled, prolonged, psychological. Predators escalate. They refine their methods. They learn from mistakes and develop more sophisticated approaches. Martin's progression fits that pattern. Early victims killed quickly and hidden. Later victim held captive for weeks. Death caused by neglect rather than violence. Psychological torture prioritized over physical. The question now is whether there are others. Stephanie and the 2 unidentified victims were found in one location Martin had access to. But Martin worked for the HVAC company for 11 years, serviced properties across 5 states, had access to dozens of buildings. Are there other burial sites we haven't found? I've submitted requests to property managers and demolition companies across Martin's service area, asking them to check crawl spaces, basements, and storage areas in buildings where Martin had access. So far, no additional remains have been found. But the requests only went out 4 months ago. Demolition is slow. Inspection takes time. And some properties may never be demolished or inspected. If Martin buried victims in locations that remain in active use, in spaces that are never accessed, those remains might stay hidden indefinitely. Derek was 14 when Stephanie disappeared. Too young to have been involved according to the timeline. Martin was working alone then, acting without his son's assistance. Which means Derek's involvement came later, that Martin eventually brought his son into his activities, but didn't start that way. Derek has been informed about the Bend discovery. His attorney released a brief statement saying Derek had no knowledge of any crimes beyond Rachel's abduction, and that he's cooperating with investigators. That cooperation hasn't materialized. Derek hasn't provided information about other potential victims or locations. Either he genuinely doesn't know, or he's still protecting his father. Martin has also been informed. He declined to make any statement. His attorney says Martin maintains his innocence regarding Rachel's murder and denies involvement in any other crimes. The physical evidence from the Bend shed contradicts that denial. But Martin isn't required to confess. He's already serving life without parole. Additional charges wouldn't change his sentence. He has no legal incentive to provide information. But morally, he has an obligation. 2 families are waiting to know who their daughters, sisters, mothers were. 2 women are reduced to forensic case numbers because Martin won't speak. That's another kind of cruelty. Another way he maintains control even from prison. Carol has followed the Bend discovery closely. She's reached out to Stephanie's family, connected with them, offered support. She's told me it helps to know she's not alone, that other families share this specific kind of grief. They've formed a small advocacy group, pushing for more thorough investigation of properties Martin accessed, lobbying for funding for forensic analysis of the unidentified remains. It's productive grief. It's grief turned into action. I admire that, even as I worry about the toll it takes. Carol looks older than she should. The years since Rachel's death have worn her down physically. But she's determined. She's not going to let Martin's silence be the final word. Neither am I. I've expanded my cold case review to include disappearances across Martin's entire employment history, not just the cases I initially flagged. I'm looking at every missing woman between 18 and 35 who disappeared within 50 miles of locations where Martin worked. That's a broad search, and it generates a lot of noise. Most of those disappearances have explanations unrelated to Martin. But I'm methodical. I'm checking each case, looking for the pattern indicators, morning routines, athletic profiles, extended time before discovery, environmental death factors. So far, I've identified 3 additional possibles. Cases where the victim profile matches, the location overlaps with Martin's employment, and the disappearance circumstances suggest abduction rather than voluntary departure. None of the 3 have been solved. None have strong alternative suspects. All 3 families are still looking for answers. I've contacted those families. I've explained the potential connection. I've been careful to manage expectations. I'm very clear that this is investigative theory, not confirmed evidence. But they deserve to know. They deserve to have Martin's name on their radar. If future evidence emerges linking Martin to their cases, they'll be prepared. One of those families is pursuing their own investigation now, hiring a private investigator to look specifically at Martin's connection. I've shared my research with them, provided employment records and timeline overlaps. I don't know if it will lead anywhere, but it's more than they had before. That's what this work is. Incremental progress. Tiny steps forward. Most leads go nowhere. Most theories don't pan out. But occasionally, a demolition crew finds a crawl space. Occasionally, someone remembers something new. Occasionally, a piece of evidence surfaces that changes everything. Rachel's case taught me that. For 2 weeks, we had nothing. Then we had a cabin. Then we had Derek. Then we had Martin. Then we had scratches on a wall. Each piece came from a different source, a different angle. None of it came from obvious investigation paths. All of it came from persistence. From continuing to look, even when the looking seemed futile. So I keep looking. I keep reviewing files. I keep the boxes even though my office complains about the space they take up. I keep Martin's name on watch lists and alert systems. I keep checking demolition notices and property transfers in his service area. Because there are families still waiting. Because there are women still missing. Because 25 scratches on a concrete wall mean something. And I owe it to Rachel to make sure that meaning extends beyond her own case. The rain is still falling outside my window. It's been a wet year, storms rolling through every few weeks. The sound is constant now, rhythmic, steady. I've learned to work through it, to let it fade into background. But sometimes I stop and listen. Sometimes I think about Rachel, locked in that cabin, hearing rain on the roof, knowing each storm meant water she couldn't reach, weather she couldn't escape. Derek heard that rain too. He visited during storms. He walked past the cabin door in the rain. He knew she was inside. He knew she was suffering. And he did nothing. That's the part I still can't reconcile. Not the initial crime. I understand how someone could be manipulated into helping with an abduction, especially if they'd been groomed over time. But the maintenance of the crime, the daily choice to let it continue, the sustained decision to allow another person's suffering, that requires a different kind of psychological state. That requires active suppression of empathy, conscious override of moral objection. Derek managed that for 25 days. 25 times he knew Rachel was trapped and chose to leave her there. 25 times he prioritized his father's plan over Rachel's life. The law gave him 20 years for that. Carol doesn't think it's enough. She's probably right. But it's what we have. It's the justice the system could provide. And maybe that's the final lesson of this case. Justice is imperfect. Resolution is incomplete. Truth is partial. We do what we can with the tools we have, and we live with the gaps. Rachel marked 25 days because she needed to document reality, to create evidence, to resist the erasure Martin and Derek attempted. That resistance mattered. It gave us timeline. It gave us proof of consciousness. It gave us a window into her experience that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Every case should have that kind of evidence. Every victim should have the chance to leave that kind of record. But most don't. Most disappear without documentation, without witnesses, without scratches on walls. Their families are left with silence and absence, and questions that never get answered. Rachel's family has answers. Not all of them. Not enough. But more than most families in similar situations ever receive. That's something. It's not comfort, but it's something. The work continues. The files stay open. The rain keeps falling. And somewhere, in a prison cell, Martin knows things he'll never tell. That's his final act of control, his last exercise of power over the people he hurt. He can't hurt anyone new now. But he can withhold information. He can let families suffer in uncertainty. He can keep his secrets until he dies. Unless something changes. Unless evidence surfaces that forces disclosure. Unless Derek decides, finally, to tell everything he knows. I'm not counting on that. But I'm ready if it happens. The boxes are here. The files are current. The timeline is documented. If new information comes, I'll know where it fits, what it means, who it helps. That's my job. That's what I owe Rachel, and Stephanie, and the 2 unidentified women in the crawl space, and the families still waiting. Stay ready. Stay informed. Keep the cases active in whatever ways possible. Keep counting the days until truth catches up with silence.